All the Young Dudes, Peter's Perspective by Lanky Idiot. Chapter 3. First Year, The Sorting. The boat ride to Hogwarts made Peter's stomach churn all over again when he'd just begun to feel better from the train ride. He realized upon exiting the boat that he was hungry from not having eaten since breakfast, and his empty stomach was worse from the oncoming nausea. They made it across the lake with minimal incident. Peter junked his foot in the water trying to board the boat, and one of the girls in the group snickered. He shrunk down in the boat beside James, who gave him a pat on the back and said, "All right, Pete," so quietly that just the two of them could hear. Remus closed his eyes as soon as he got into the boat, looking a little sick himself. He seemed to detest the water and boats from the moment the first years were heard in the direction of the lake. Sirius was silently staring ahead, probably watching as the castle grew nearer and nearer. James was chatting to one of the girls in the boat, talking about the awful giant squid. They were going back and forth, debating the creature's existence. Peter hoped it wasn't real, but James was of the opinion that it was, because his father had supposedly seen it, and who was Peter to question James and Fleeman Potter? The water was so dark that it mirrored the stars and the moon. Peter looked up and noticed that the moon was waxing gibbous. He'd read in his astronomy book once and could tell the difference between all of the moon cycles. A waxing gibbous is the stage of a moon phase when it transcends from a half moon into a full moon. It is considered to be the final step before becoming full. "So pretty," he said aloud, before looking at James, who was deep in debate with the girl and not paying attention to him. He looked towards Sirius, next, who was still staring straight ahead. He either didn't hear Peter or was ignoring him. Peter guessed probably the latter. He then looked at Remus, who was looking up with one eye open. He must have noticed Peter looking, because as soon as Peter opened his mouth to speak, he closed his eye again and leaned forward into his hands. "Fine then," Peter thought. "I'll keep to myself." After the boat ride, Peter and the rest of the first years followed the gamekeeper up a trail to the huge stone walls of the castle. They were met by another professor and led into the great hall. Peter's shoe was still damp and made little squelching noises as he walked. But when the group was passed along to a stern-looking professor, Peter completely forgot about it. She introduced herself as Professor McGonagall and explained, very briefly, how the sorting would work. Once she was done with her explanation, Professor McGonagall lined them up and began calling out names in alphabetical order. Simon Arnold was the first to be called, and Peter was glad there were several letters worth of names before Pettigrew, so he could watch several other students make the walk from the head to the table before it was his turn. A few first years were sorted one by one, until it was Sirius' turn. Peter held his breath in anticipation. Nobody looked more shocked than Sirius when the head called out Gryffindor. Peter noticed the dozen dirty looks from the Slytherin table as Sirius took his seat with the Gryffindors. And Peter was very grateful he wasn't Sirius. He had his own problems related to the sorting, but at least he wasn't breaking a 500-year tradition with his placement. Remus was next of the fourth of them, and he was also sorted in Gryffindor. Peter bit the inside of his cheek. Surely, if one of the blacks and a beat-up-looking half-blood was sorted into Gryffindor, Peter had a chance. He made a mental note to stop letting blood status come to mind first when thinking of Remus. Remus, though rough-looking, was actually very quiet so far. He hadn't been unkind to any of them, and he asked questions that made sense for someone who didn't grow up in a pure-blood family. When it was Peter's turn, He took careful steps toward the grotty little stool the hat was on. Tripping in front of the entire school on his first day seemed like a poor tone to set for the next 7 years he was going to spend at Hogwarts. He sat on the edge of the stool and swallowed hard. Professor McGonagall set the hat onto his head, and she sat very still, waiting, and then the hat began to speak. Peter hadn't heard what the thing had said to anyone else, so this must be a private conversation between the two of them. "You're a tricky one," the hat said, and Peter felt himself trembling. "2 houses would suit you nicely." Peter didn't know which two the hat was referring to, but he really hoped of them wasn't Slytherin. No, you'd think not, but perhaps. The hat was deliberating with itself, or maybe it could hear Peter's thoughts. He felt like he'd been in there for so much longer than anyone before him. It felt like the hat was speaking directly into his mind, and he hated it. He felt completely exposed, and it was just a hat. He would benefit from the company of friends, but would they benefit from your company? Don't make me regret this, Mr. Pettigrew. Gryffindor! Peter let out a breath he didn't even realize he was holding in. He was so happy he could have wept. He was a Gryffindor, just like James would be, like his father, who would be so proud had been. His mother would be proud too. She surely didn't think he was clever enough to be a Ravenclaw. He didn't think about what the hat had said until he was sitting at the long table beside Remus, who was just staring down at the place setting in front of him. There was a pretty red-headed girl, Lily Evans, from what McGonagall had said, sitting across from him, and Sirius was across from Remus. What had the hat meant by it? Don't make me regret this. Was he supposed to be somewhere else? And what had he meant when it said the thing about his friends? Peter's mind was racing, so much so that he almost missed James' name being called. Peter tried not to think about the hat's words once James had joined them at the table. Nobody was surprised that James Potter was been sorted into Gryffindor. He was sorted into the house as James Potter, so that had to count for something, didn't it? Peter was definitely feeling very proud and very lionly now. "How great is that?" James said as he took his place on the bench beside Peter. "We all made it." James Potter was acting like they'd been won first place. His excitement was infectious, and Peter couldn't help but smile. This was going to be great. He already had 3 friends. Well, he didn't know if he could count Remus and Sirius as friends yet, but James seemed to like them, and he trusted James to be a good judge of character. Sirius let out a groan as his head fell onto his arms on the table. "Speak for yourself," he said, muffled as he spoke into his sleeve. "My father is going to kill me." "I can't believe it," Peter said, because it was the only thing he could manage. He couldn't keep his hands still, and they kept ringing in circles on his lap. He was looking around, taking in all of the other students and the colorful decorations in the different houses. Peter jumped a little when Professor McGonagall appeared behind him and Remus. He looked back at her as she placed her hand on Remus' shoulder. "Mr. Lupin," she said, and glanced among the 4 of them before looking at Remus directly. "If you would come to my office after dinner. It's next to the Gryffindor common room. One of the prefects can show you." Remus nodded, and she smiled softly, accepting that as an answer, and headed back towards the long professor's table at the front of the dining hall. "What was that about?" James asked. "McGonagall wants to see you already?" Remus looked at him, slouched forward a little bit, shrugging. Peter looked at James, and then Sirius, who lifted his head to stare at Remus. The food appeared before anything else was said, and everyone happily dug in. There was more food at one table than Peter had ever seen, and he'd been to quite a few of his mother's parties. Peter noticed that even Sirius stopped looking miserable long enough to eat, and he did it with the most proper table etiquette Peter had ever seen. James was excitedly chatting, so some of the older students and Remus silently ate several helpings of everything in front of them. "Well, Pete," James said, stretching as everyone stood up to go to their respective common rooms, "it's certainly not my mom's cooking, but it will do nicely for the next 7 years." Peter smiled at that and nodded in agreement. Euphemia was one of British best chefs, in he and James' opinion, and her mind's peas were absolutely to die for. "Yeah, I would do just about anything to have your mom's cooking every night," Peter said, and James smiled as he thought of his mother fondly. Sirius overheard and quirked an eyebrow, as if to ask what was going on between the boys. James smiled and explained that he and Peter were neighbors growing up. The older Gryffindors were off quickly, but one of them stuck around and began to gather the first years. "Gryffindor first years, over here, please," he called, raising his wand up. The tip was going as he made tiny circles above his head. It was very effective in rounding them up all, and he smiled at his little group. "Frank Longbottom, nice to meet you all. I'm one of the Gryffindor prefects, so if you need anything at all, feel free to ask." Peter, James, and another girl, and everyone else just blankly stared at him, but still he smiled brightly. "Right then, let's be off, shall we?" The castle was even more grand than further in they went. There were so many doorways, lots of interesting portraits and paintings, and even moving stairs, and Peter began to worry that he would spend a lot of time lost in the hallways. When they finally reached the hallway that Frank said led straight to the entrance to Gryffindor Tower, Peter let out a little sigh. He liked Hogwarts so far, and everyone he'd met seemed nice, but he was grateful they were almost in their rooms. Sirius and Peter were in the back somehow. They had ended up in a line, and James and Remus were a few students ahead of them. Peter nearly slammed into Sirius when James grabbed Sirius' arm and pulled him into a halt. "Oi, hang back a minute, lads. Let's see if Remus wants us to wait for him." Sirius shrugged, and they both followed James several places towards Professor McGonagall's office. When they arrived, Remus wasn't there, and even James raised an eyebrow in confusion. "Well?" Peter asked, a little anxious to be away from the group. "Are we waiting?" Would they get in trouble for not going straight to the common room? They were just first years, and they didn't know Remus very well. It's not that Peter didn't understand where James was coming from, but he was a little nervous about potential consequences on the first day. He supposed he would want someone to wait for him too if he was Remus' position. "Nah, you go on ahead," James said. He was smiling brightly, and his eyebrow had dropped to a normal level. Peter looked at Sirius and then back to James. "Aren't you coming with us?" "I will stick around a bit. You missed the passport from Frank." Peter's hands began to fidget again, and he wondered to himself when he picked up that nervous habit. He didn't love the idea of being alone with Sirius. He got the feeling the boy didn't like him much, even if they'd only known each other for a few hours. Boys like Sirius didn't usually like boys like Peter. "Oh, come on then," Sirius said to Peter after a moment. Then he rolled his eyes, headed toward the portrait of the fat lady. Peter looked back at James, who nodded, and then he turned on his heels and followed Sirius up their room. The common room was enormous and warm, with lots of comfortable-looking furniture and happy students lounging about. Peter followed Sirius up a winding staircase to the top, and they opened the door which led into their shared room. Each bed had thick red velvet curtains for privacy, and there was a private fireplace on one of the walls. Sirius flopped onto his bed silently as soon as they entered the room. "Oh, so he is back to sulking then," Peter thought to himself. Peter walked over to his bed and began unpacking his things. He didn't remember packing any of this, since he and his mom had done the majority of it several days ago, so he was reminded of all of his items as he worked. He listened to Sirius sighing to himself and tried to tune it out as he dug to the bottom of his trunk. Where was his favorite jumper? Sirius' bed creaked a little as he shifted on the mattress, and the sound made Peter's skin itch. Where did the magazine go? The bag seemed to get deeper and deeper as he began to feel more and more anxious. Where was his wand? James and Remus entered as Peter felt everything unraveling and he lost it completely. He looked up from the great mass of things in front of him, and his voice cracked as he spoke. "I can't find my wand. Mom made me pack it so I won't lose it on the train, but it's not here." "Pete," James grinned. "Your mom asked me to look after it, remember?" "Oh, yes, that's right." He remembered the moment at the train station, and his shoulders relaxed. "Well, that's one less thing to worry about." Peter heard Sirius and James talking as they unpacked, but his mind was still too much of a cloudy mess to really focus on what they were saying. He was at Hogwarts, with his things and his wand. He was with James, and they even shared a room. Everything's going to be fine. "You know," James said as Sirius' stack of books continued to grow, "there's a library here." "I know, but these are mostly Muggle books. My Uncle Alfred left them to me, and Mom would set them all on fire if I left them at home." Peter caught his mouth from falling open as he looked at Sirius with wide eyes. What kind of mother would burn his son's things? Though, from what he remembered about the Black family, they were very choosy about the kind of people they associated. More specifically, they were very particular about blood status. Next, Sirius hauled a full-sized record player and a dozen vinyls out of his trunk. Peter had never seen one in person before. His mother also didn't allow Muggle items in their room. "Is that Abbey Road?" James asked after making his way across the room. It seemed he was just as interested as Peter was, but because he knew what the albums were and not because he'd never seen a record before. "Yeah," Sirius grinned, and that Remus saw the shiny vinyl. "You must be a Muggle-born. Never met a wizard who knows the Beatles, except my cousin, Andromeda. She bought them for me." Remus nodded slightly. "I love the Beatles. One of the boys in my room at home got at least 10 singles, but he never lets me touch them." Peter turned to look at Remus then, hoping something about his face would give him more information, but it didn't. Remus had come back to his tough, hard-to-read self after letting his guard down for a moment over the records. "Boys at home? You mean your brother?" Sirius asked, and Peter was glad he asked. He knew better than to question a boy like Remus. "No." Remus shook his head and shoved the record back at Sirius. "I live in a children's home." "Like an orphanage?" Peter asked, because the words fell out of his mouth before his brain could stop them. He really hadn't meant to pry, and Sirius asked questions first. "No," Remus snapped at him before he turned away from all of them. He crossed back to his area of the room and continued unpacking silently. Peter winced, but felt himself get a little angry at the way Remus snapped at him. It was just a question, and he hadn't meant to offend Remus. Why was he being so cagey about where he came from anyways? Surely being a half-blood couldn't be that bad. The Potters never minded having their sword around, and Fleemont and Euphemia were the nicest people Peter knew. While Sirius and James were talking about Quidditch, Remus climbed into his bed and closed the curtains harshly. Peter rolled his eyes before looking up from his belongings to where James and Sirius were. "You'd think he'd try harder to make friends," Peter whispered to the other two boys, "especially if he's Muggle-born." He immediately regretted it, but his mother's thoughts on half-bloods weren't so easily abandoned. "Are you sure the hat wasn't supposed to put you on Slytherin?" Sirius asked, shooting him a sharp look. James didn't say anything, but the look on his face said he was disappointed too. Peter supposed that he deserved that. Maybe Sirius was right. He would have to try harder. He wanted to try harder. He didn't want to be like his mother about something as meaningless as blood status. That is not how he wanted to make her proud.